Okay, today we continue with the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to be looking at the first phase of the Civil Rights Movement, which begins at roughly 1955. We'll begin by looking at a death in the Delta. A young man named Emmett Till is going to be the center of some controversy in the Civil Rights Movement, mostly unintentionally, I'm sure. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was visiting relatives in the South when he is kidnapped and killed by two men because he had whistled at a white woman, which was one of the men's wives, in a store, and he had called her baby. He had bragged about his white girlfriend back in Chicago, and the two men come and kidnap him, and his body is found later, badly mutilated. The men who killed him are put on trial, and they are acquitted of the murder. They will openly admit their guilt after the trial, and so it shows the problem of the court system in the South, that there was lots of publicity about this trial, and that these gentlemen had gotten off scot-free. Emmett Till's mother will have an open casket funeral in Chicago to show the world what the Southern prejudice had done to her son. There was really no provocation for it. Eventually, the court victories are going to prove to not be enough, and so a new strategy will be found to deal with the racial prejudice in the South. This new strategy is called nonviolence, or civil disobedience, and it's the same strategy that will be used by Gandhi in India. So, they put this into practice in 1955. They begin with the Montgomery bus boycott. At the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks is going to refuse to sit in the back of the bus, and that was against the law, and so she is arrested and thrown in jail. The Montgomery Improvement Association will at that point boycott the buses. They organize so that the African Americans of Montgomery do not ride the bus system, which were they made up most of the population that did ride the buses. So it's an economic hardship for the busing system. They continue this boycott for 381 days, and the movement will be helped by the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. At the time, he was a 27-year-old minister, virtually unknown up until this event. This is what puts him into the spotlight. The courts will eventually rule that segregation of buses is illegal, and so it's a minor victory in the civil rights effort. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to leave Montgomery, and he will form the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And with the SCLC, he is going to begin attacking voting rights and other methods of segregation in the South. There will be other organizations other than the SCLC that will be formed. Among them, the NAACP, which we've already talked about, is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And you also have a group called CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality. And typically CORE, like the NAACP, is going to work through legal means, changing things in the court system. Another group that gains a lot of prominence is going to be SNCC, or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And basically SNCC was comprised of high school, but mostly college kids. And unfortunately SNCC ends up being a little bit more violent than the rest of the groups because they tended to be working at the grassroots level. They're going out and getting people registered to vote. They're going into the towns. They're going into the voting stations, all kinds of stuff. So they're more up in people's faces, and so they tend to be a bit on the more violent side. The second phase of the Civil Rights Movement will take place from 1960 to 1963, and we start to see more and more demonstrations taking place. In 1960, we get the Greensboro sit-in, and what happens in Greensboro, there's a lunch counter at a Woolworth's, and Woolworth's is like a five and dime store, and they would have lunch counters offering lunch in there. And the lunch counters were just for whites. The blacks had a different lunch counter in the back of the store where they weren't as visible. And so you'll have some students, part of SNCC, that are going to sit at the lunch counter. They were black and white students. And the TV crew shows up because they got word that something was going to go down at this Woolworths. And so the TV shows up and they show this encounter to the rest of the world. And what you see is these students getting the crap beaten out of them just because they're sitting at a lunch counter. They're not doing anything else other than sitting at the lunch counter. In 1961, the Freedom Rides will take place, and the Freedom Rides were sponsored by both CORE and SNCC. What this was meant to do is test the laws integrating public bus terminals. The courts had passed laws saying that it was okay to integrate the bus terminals. There wasn't black and white seating, that they were all together. And so they began to ride on the buses down to the south, and they were fine until they reached the deep south, like Mississippi and Louisiana. At that point, the buses are attacked, and men are going to attack it and burn the buses. Both black and white passengers are going to be beaten up. The buses are set on fire, and the police who were supposed to be escorting them turn a blind eye or conveniently get lost when they get attacked. In 1963, we get the Birmingham movement, and the Birmingham movement will take place from April to May of 1963. There were demonstrations in Birmingham calling for the integration of stores and integration of hiring practices, and it's during this demonstration that Martin Luther King is going to be arrested, and he's held in isolation in a jail cell. While he is in isolation, he writes one of his more famous documents called The Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and he writes it in the margins of a newspaper. But basically what he does in this letter is he is explaining why he's pushing so hard for equality, and that he doesn't want to have to explain to his children why they are considered different and why they're considered not as good. And that's his incentive for getting civil rights, and getting civil rights as soon as possible. Well, eventually so many people are arrested that the movement begins to die down, and so the leaders of the organizations come together and they decide, well, let's get the children involved. And so you get the Children's Crusade May 2nd of 1963. And this Children's Crusade is children getting out of school and coming to demonstrate in their parents' place. And it captures the nation's attention. Over 1,000 children are going to demonstrate, and a little over 900 are going to be arrested and thrown in jail. Now, Birmingham is going to be a very successful movement because of the Birmingham sheriff. His name is Bull Connor. As sheriff, he was very hot-headed, and this is going to work in the favor of the movement because basically when the children come out, he snaps. He just cannot handle it. He orders out dog teams and fire hoses and beatings as the nation watches on television as this happens, and people are just aghast that this is being allowed to happen. JFK will eventually intervene, and he introduces the Civil Rights Act to Congress at this point. However, tragedy will strike the movement during the second phase. Medgar Evers, who was a leader of the SCLC, is going to be murdered in his own driveway. He is killed by Byron de la Beckwith, and Beckwith was tried twice for the murder, but both times he had a hung jury. However, in 1994, there was new evidence, and so a trial came about, and he was convicted, and Beckwith will die in prison at the age of 80 in 2001. And so that's the first and second phases of the Civil Rights Movement.